This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today's video topic was suggested in my comment section. Now, in a previous video that I will be leaving linked, I looked into the possible reasons that Queen Elizabeth I chose to or was made to remain unmarried. So I think it only seems fair for us to take a look at her potential husbands, her erstwhile suitors, if you will, to see just what became of them. But before we jump into today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring another video on this channel. And as I'm sure we are now all aware, we can't really have missed it, we are now a couple of weeks into a new year. It is 2024. I do hope it has been treating you well thus far. And I think it's as good a time as any to make some new starts of our own, to stick to any resolutions we might have made and perhaps make good on some plans. And I will be honest, my perennial resolution used to be, this will be the year that I build and launch my website. But while I do have many talents, I am not a computer programmer, nowhere near, in fact. And honestly, whenever I tried to get all of the website stuff going, to try and get it up and running, it just quickly felt super overwhelming. Squarespace made all the difference. Their Fluid Engine website design system offers users a massive variety of website templates to get you started. Those templates are all really easy to customize. In fact, you can customize them in every way. It's just drag and drop. And for even more convenience, you can edit your website not only on your desktop, but also on your phone on the go. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/readingthepast to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. But now it's time to take a look at the lives of the men who might have married Elizabeth. The first person to be linked to Elizabeth as a potential spouse was Charles, Duke of Angoulême, later Duke of Orleans. He was 12 years old, the third son of King Francis I of France, and the subject of a potential marriage treaty with the one-year-old Princess Elizabeth. For King Henry VIII to consider a third son for his daughter, who, following the first act of succession, was legally his only legitimate child and heir, was an arguably unusual choice. Perhaps this is why Henry was looking for something that might sweeten the deal for him. In particular, he wanted Francis to intercede on his behalf with the Pope and in the cause of having his marriage to Anne Boleyn recognised as being legitimate by that Pope. Francis was not keen to challenge the Pope's ruling in this way, and he also apparently had questions about how legitimate Elizabeth actually was. Just over a year later, these discussions would be decisively ended and they would never be revisited. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed on the 19th of May 1536. During these proceedings, her marriage to Henry was deemed to be null and void, and so Elizabeth followed in the footsteps of her elder half-sister Mary. She was now no longer the Princess Elizabeth. She was instead simply the Lady Elizabeth, the King's second natural daughter. As for her one-time suitor Charles, he is said to have been the best-looking of Francis I's sons. He had survived a bout of smallpox, which did leave him blind in one eye, but otherwise apparently did not affect his appearance. He is remembered principally for his recklessness. However, much of this, I think, may be due to his youth. In 1545, he reportedly entered some houses that had been sealed off due to, quote, plague. He went there with his elder brother, the Dauphin Henry. While Henry came out unaffected, within hours, Charles had fallen dangerously ill. He died on the 9th of September 1545, aged just 23. There are rumours that in the weeks preceding Thomas Seymour's 1547 marriage to the recently widowed Dowager Queen Katherine Parr, that he had proposed marriage to the 13-year-old Elizabeth. Now, if there are any truth to these rumours, it is said that Elizabeth rebuffed him. I have made a video on Thomas Seymour, which I will leave linked. For a time, the young Elizabeth made her home in Catherine's household. While there, Thomas Seymour, reportedly with the complicity of his new wife, engaged in highly questionable behaviour with this young charge. Perhaps the best-known incident reportedly happened in the garden at Hanworth, where Katherine Parr held Elizabeth while Thomas Seymour cut her gown into 100 pieces. By May 1548, though, it does seem that this behaviour had become too much for Catherine, who was, by that point, pregnant with her first child, and so Elizabeth was sent to live with Lord and Lady Denny. Katherine Parr would experience complications following the birth of her daughter Mary. Catherine died on September the 5th, 1548. Thomas Seymour, now a widower, was soon pursuing Elizabeth as a potential bride. Elizabeth was apparently cautious but not unwilling. Her friend, confidant and governess, Cat Astley, thought it to be a good match, and so she promoted it. A little over 4 months after Katherine Parr's death, on the 17th of January 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason. Among other things, it was alleged that Thomas Seymour had sought to marry Elizabeth so that once he kidnapped and perhaps killed his nephew, King Edward VI, he would be able to rule the country through his new wife. Thomas Seymour, Baron Sudeley, was executed on the 20th of March, 1549. He was around 40 years old. In 1554, the new Queen, Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, was determined to marry her first cousin once removed, Philip. The match was an unpopular one to say the least. Discord and finally rebellion bubbled up. One of the potential intentions of the Wyatt Rebellion was to replace Mary I with Elizabeth, who they may have been seeking to marry off to Edward Courtenay, Earl of Devon. Edward Courtenay had spent his teens and early 20s imprisoned in the Tower of London. His father was arrested and subsequently executed for treason. The whole family had been under suspicion, and Edward had remained incarcerated. Apparently Edward's father had been plotting to marry his son, Edward, to Henry VIII's elder daughter, Mary, later Mary I. Edward Courtenay's release coincided with Queen Mary I's triumphant royal entrance into London on the 3rd of August, 1553. When the plans of the Wyatt Rebellion's conspirators came to light, Edward Courtenay was questioned. He was promptly back in the Tower on the 12th of February, 1554. However, Sir Thomas Wyatt used part of his scaffold speech to vehemently assert the innocence of both Edward Courtenay and Elizabeth in relation to the plots. Edward was transferred to Fotheringay Castle on the 25th of May, 1554. He remained there until the 6th of April, 1555. Thereafter, the Marian regime sent him overseas. Within months, he was engaging with the conspiracy being spearheaded by Sir Henry Dudley. Once again, marriage between Edward Courtenay and Elizabeth was being suggested as part of a plot that sought to remove Queen Mary I from her throne. At around the same time, while all of this plotting was going on, King Henry II of France was offering to arrange for Edward Courtenay to marry Mary, Queen of Scots. This was all to come to nothing. Edward Courtenay contracted a fever which would prove fatal. He died at Padua on the 18th of September 1556. He was 29 years old. As for Elizabeth's brother-in-law Philip, perhaps unsurprisingly, he was hoping to see her married off to an ally of his. He was especially keen, reportedly, on the candidacy of his cousin, Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy. Philip tried to, in quotes, encourage Elizabeth to agree to the match in person in March 1557. Elizabeth, we might assume, would have had a fair idea that her half-sister was not a well woman. She was going to have to hope that prevarication would be enough to spare her from being coerced into this unwanted foreign match. Keeping herself away from court at her house at Hatfield no doubt assisted her in this task. Mary I died on the 17th of November, 1558. Elizabeth was Queen of England. She would now have the ultimate say in whether she made a marriage or not. As for Emmanuel, in 1559 he married his first cousin once removed, Margaret of France, Duchess of Berry, sister of King Henry II. He spent much of his life working to recover the Savoy lands that his father had lost. He died on the 30th of August 1580, aged 52. His cause of death is not recorded. Soon after Queen Mary I's death, her widower Philip had his representatives float the idea that he might be a suitable match to marry Elizabeth. However, in April 1559, Elizabeth heard that Philip and his people were exploring marriage with Elizabeth of Valois, despite the fact that Elizabeth I had not answered their suit to her. And as if to confuse matters further still, Elizabeth of Valois had formerly been the intended bride for Philip's son and heir, Carlos, Prince of Asturias. Reportedly, the English queen opined that Philip, quote, could not have been much in love with her, since he did not have the patience to wait 4 months. Philip did marry Elizabeth of Valois in 1559. She would die of complications from childbirth in 1568. Philip's fourth and final wife was his niece, Anna of Austria. They married in 1570. She also predeceased Philip, dying in 1580. During this period and in its aftermath, Philip's relationship with Elizabeth and with England deteriorated. After all, it would be just a few years later, in 1588, that his Spanish Armada would threaten to invade England and displace Elizabeth. Indeed, tension and risk of invasion would remain a factor of Anglo-Spanish relations until 1604. By that point, the key figureheads of this antagonism were dead. Philip died in 1598, Elizabeth in 1603. During 1559 and 1560, the Lutheran King of Denmark, Frederick II, entered into marriage negotiations with Elizabeth I. He was less than a year younger than her, having been born on the 1st of July 1534. The principal motivation for these marital negotiations was reputedly the Danish crown's desire to frustrate the marital aspirations of their Swedish rival, of whom more in a moment. In the end, Frederick married Sophie of Mecklenburg-Güstrow on the 20th of July 1572. Their second daughter, Anne of Denmark, would go on to marry James VI of Scots, later James I of England, and thus Queen Elizabeth I's suitor would be father to a Queen of Scots and a Queen of England. Evidence for continued warm relations with England despite these failed marriage plans may be found in the fact that Frederick would be elected to the Order of the Garter in 1578. Frederick died on the 4th of April 1588, aged 53. He was succeeded by his son, Christian IV. The suit of another Lutheran, Eric XIV of Sweden, had begun before either he or Elizabeth had inherited their thrones. Effusive declarations of love made their way from Sweden to England, but things really stepped up between the summer of 1559 and the autumn of 1562, as Patrick Collinson explains that during this period there were a, quote, series of Swedish missions that came laden with massy bullion and stables worth of piebald horses. Eric wrote of his desire to come to England and woo Elizabeth in person. She, on her part, attempted to politely dissuade him. He would have none of it, and eventually plans were put in place to be able to host him at Hampton Court Palace. As it was, he would not be able to make this journey in the end. Eric would ultimately marry a former mistress of his, Karen Mansdotter, by whom he already had children. This pair married on the 4th of July 1568. Eric's sanity was called into question. It is said that he began to exhibit paranoia, violence and cruelty. In September 1568, Eric was captured during a rebellion that was led by his half-brother John. John would take the throne of Sweden following the deposition of Eric. It is believed that Eric was given arsenic-laced soup during his imprisonment, which would lead to his death on the 26th of February 1577. He was 43. Another possible suitor was the courtier and diplomat Sir William Pickering. He was deemed to be a zealous Protestant during the reign of Edward VI. He was later implicated in the Wyatt Rebellion and ultimately fled to the continent to avoid the consequences of that. Susan Doran writes that, quote, as early as the 26th of November 1588, Pickering had been mentioned as a possible husband for Elizabeth, and on his return to England he was evidently taken seriously as a suitor. Bets placed in London were said to be at 25 to 100 that Pickering would be king. He, however, took himself less seriously and stated his personal view that the Queen intended to die a maid. Pickering would also remain unmarried until his death, on the 4th of January 1575, when he was around 60 years old. James Hamilton, 3rd Earl of Arran, was in the line of succession to the throne of Scotland, as was his father, who had acted as regent of Scotland. In 1559, James returned from France. His departure from there has been characterised as a kind of escape from life as a virtual hostage. He was back in Scotland by the 19th of September. At this point, he and his father showed themselves publicly to be committed to the Protestant faith by joining the congregation. During James's journey or flight from France to Scotland, he stopped in England. He was taken to Hampton Court Palace, and there, in the gardens, he, completely by accident I'm sure, bumped into Queen Elizabeth. Their marriage was being suggested as a means to ensure an Anglo-Scottish peace. It would also bolster James Hamilton's claim to the throne in Scotland, should Mary Queen of Scots, for some reason, not return from France. By the end of 1560, though, Elizabeth does appear to have favoured the idea that the newly widowed Mary Queen of Scots should marry James instead. This was viewed as a way to destabilise French influence in Scotland, which would in turn help to smooth relations between Scotland and England, or at least so it was hoped. By late 1561, James appears to have undergone some sort of mental health crisis. He became deeply paranoid. He made his way into the presence of John Knox and there reported that his father was plotting against Mary Queen of Scots, apparently with the intent to incriminate him. Rosalind K. Marshall explains that, quote, Knox could see that he was mentally ill and tried to calm him, but Arran insisted on sending a message to the Queen asking what he should do. Mary's reply fell into his father's hands and a violent scene between father and son ensued. Arran escaped from his father's castle of Kinneil down a rope of sheets and was brought to the royal court in St Andrews, talking wildly of witches and demons and claiming to be the husband of Queen Mary. Years of imprisonment followed, first in Edinburgh Castle, then into a house arrest that was supervised by his mother. His later years are obscured, but it does appear that his mental health never recovered. James Hamilton died in 1609. He was around 72 years old. Robert Dudley is probably the most well-known suitor for Elizabeth's hand. Indeed, many consider him to be the person that she truly wanted to marry. But at the start, of course, there was one big problem, and that was that Robert was already married. To make matters worse, in 1560, Robert's wife Amy was found dead in suspicious circumstances. I do have a video on this that I will leave linked as well. Elizabeth was very savvy. She understood the power of public perception. There was an investigation into Amy Dudley's death and into any role that her husband might have played in it. Robert was ultimately cleared. But then as now, as the old saying goes, mud sticks. There was simply no way that Elizabeth could hope to maintain her public reputation, to hold on to the love of her people, possibly even to keep her throne, if she chose to make such a scandalous match. However, just because they couldn't marry, that did not mean that Elizabeth could not keep him around. Indeed, he would remain her favourite. In addition to numerous grants and perks, Robert was elected to the Order of the Garter in 1559. He joined the Privy Council in 1562. Then, in 1564, he was made Earl of Leicester and Baron Denbigh. A year prior to this, in 1563, Elizabeth had suggested that Robert Dudley might be a suitable groom for Mary Queen of Scots. In around 1570, he began an affair with Douglas Sheffield, whose maiden name was Howard. He and Douglas had a son who was born in August 1574. He was named for his father, Robert Dudley. We aren't sure when or why this liaison ended, but it does seem clear that it was over by 1578, because on September the 21st of that year, Robert Dudley married Elizabeth I's first cousin once removed, Lettice Knowles, and he did this without his Queen's knowledge or permission. Robert Dudley had previously stood as godfather to Lettice's son, Robert Devereux, who later became the second Earl of Essex. When Queen Elizabeth learned of this marriage, she was furious. Husband and wife were banished from her sight. Before long, though, Robert would be rehabilitated and returned to court and to royal favour. The same could not be said for his wife Lettice. Robert died on the 4th of September 1588. He was around 56 years old. Two sons of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I were also put forward as potential candidates to be Elizabeth I's husband, supposing, of course, the Queen and her advisers could find some way to overlook their Roman Catholic faith. The sons in question were Ferdinand and Charles. Charles was the younger of the two. He was born in 1540, and it was he that Elizabeth I seemed to be considering in the second half of the 1560s. Alison Weir has pointed out that Elizabeth, quote, had acknowledged that the Archduke, Charles, was the best foreign match for her, but she waxed alternately hot and cold over the matter. In 1571, the Archduke Charles would marry his niece, Maria of Bavaria, and she would outlive him. Charles died in 1590 at the age of 50. In the same year that Charles married Maria, Elizabeth, who was by then in her late 30s, was considering a different match of her own, this time with the 19-year-old Henry, Duke of Anjou, who would later become King Henry III of France. This was a match that was supported by Henry's mother, Catherine de' Medici. Elizabeth, for her part, highlighted the differences in their ages and their faiths as being potential barriers to their future union. And certainly, the risk of faith difference in a marriage would become very evident just 1 year later, in 1572, when Henry's elder brother, King Charles IX, consented to the marriage of his sister Margaret to the Huguenot, meaning Protestant, nobleman Henry of Navarre, who would later go on to become King Henry IV of France. The wedding festivities, which were understandably attended by a large part of the Huguenot nobility, swiftly became a bloodbath, because in the early hours of the 24th of August 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day, a massacre began. I have a video on this event that I will be leaving linked. Towards the end of the decade, though, Elizabeth would be courted by Henry's younger brother Francois. He had first been proposed as a potential groom for the English Queen in 1572. By the time this courtship really took off, in 1579, Francois's elder brother Henry was the King of France, and Francois was his heir presumptive. These brothers, who had apparently never been close, had fallen out spectacularly in 1575. Francois had shown himself to be willing to threaten his brother's rule, to ally himself with his enemies. The brothers would come to uneasy terms in 1576. In 1579, Francois sent his trusted representative, Jean de Simier, to England to woo Elizabeth on his behalf. Francois would make the choice to come to England in person and unofficially later that same year. It does seem that Elizabeth was very taken with Francois. She took to calling him her frog, and after his departure, at the end of August, letters continued to pass between this couple that were full of loving words. While Elizabeth seemed to be very willing to pursue this marriage, many of her advisers appear to have been less sure. For a time, the proceedings stalled. Francois returned to England at the end of 1581, and he stayed into the early months of 1582. He hoped that this visit, that being there in person, would be enough to finalise these negotiations and bring his marriage about. Elizabeth also appears to have been hoping this marriage would take place. Even after her council made it clear that they were not in favour of the match, she seemed to hang on. Ultimately, though, she would call a halt to everything. In 1582, when everything ground to a halt, Francois would turn 27. Elizabeth would be turning 49. Just 2 years later, on the 10th of June 1584, Francois contracted an illness, a fever, and died aged 29. When Queen Elizabeth I learned of his death, she was deeply distressed. Her grief was evident, her mourning public. Before we close out this video, I do want to highlight there being a suggestion that Elizabeth I might have received a proposal of marriage from Tsar Ivan IV, who is perhaps better known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan, we are told, wrote to Elizabeth asking to receive an answer to his secret message. It has been argued by some scholars that this secret message was a verbal one, that Ivan had requested that the ambassador Anthony Jenkinson relay an oral marriage proposal to Elizabeth on his behalf in 1567. While Elizabeth was certainly happy with the trading deals that were being forged between their nations, she was no doubt unwilling to create further ties that might see her and her people being drawn into Ivan's conflicts. And after all, Ivan's reputation for cruelty had already reached the English court. Ivan died at 53 years old, on the 18th of March 1584. This was just a few months before the death of Elizabeth's frog, Francois, Duke of Anjou. So what do you think? Of these men that Elizabeth might have married? Of their ultimate fates? If you were going to choose one of them to be Elizabeth's husband, which one would you have picked? And why? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. I would also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will help to boost the engagement, and the more engagement the video gets, the more YouTube shares it out, which does help us to grow our community. As we've been talking about marriage, proposals, wooing, etc., let's try and find emojis that connect with that theme. I am looking forward to seeing what you pick in this regard. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please do share it with your friends. If you like the channel, you can let some pals know about it too. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to my channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is a perfect time to check to make sure that you haven't been unsubscribed by YouTube against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, so that way YouTube will, they claim, tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I am next planning to go live, which I do to talk about the history news, and I know that you are not going to want to miss that. We do of course have our failsafe now. Head over to my website www.katrinamarchant.com. Once there, as I'm showing on screen, if you head to the contact page, you will see there is a box where you can put your email in. That will add you to my mailing list, and I will send you an email once a week to let you know what I'm up to and to send you all the links that you might need. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.